it for a second. Keep playing.
Democracy is on the ticket this November, and getting politically engaged has never been more important, even if it's only a hashtag activism. Check out Future Hindsight, a weekly civic engagement podcast for a conversation with Alice Marwick on the role of social media and online communities to build political power. Listen to Future Hindsight wherever you get your podcasts.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
The destiny of America is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Cedar.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Monday, October 12th, 2020. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps and steps and steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, historian, author, Christopher Shaw. On money, power, and the people, the American struggle to make banking democratic. Meanwhile, Amy Coney Barrett hearings begin with multiple COVID and would-be COVID carriers in the room. And the COVID in chief gets a green light, well, actually a greenish-yellowish, sort of an avocado light, to hit the campaign trail in Florida. Speaking of Florida, Florida explodes with new COVID cases as 13 states hit record highs. Senate Republicans are trying to sabotage an economic stimulus deal. California Republicans set up fake drop boxes, presumably to ballot harvest. Federal court temporarily reverses the expanded Ohio drop box program, and another in Pennsylvania tosses Trump's mail-in voting lawsuit. Anthony Fauci rips the Trump ad that twists his words. And one dead after a Pinkerton security guard shoots during a Denver protest. Lastly, as the Republican Senate and House picture darkens, Republican Senator Dan Sullivan is caught in a lobbying scandal involving Pebble Mine. All this and more on today's program. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. We are now, I believe it is 21 days. Is it 21 days, Brendan, that we're out from the election?
By my math, my arithmetic, my abacus, 21 days.
All right. I mean, there's a lot of qualifiers there. I imagine you're using the same one as everyone else. if it's not 21 days, it's 22 days. I mean, it could actually end up, I mean, let's be clear here. It is very likely, well, I don't know if it's very likely. It is likely that we will not know who the winner of the election is on so-called election day. That is November 3rd this year. But that is presumably when all voting has to end, and the counting either begins or continues, depending on which batch of ballots you're talking about in which state. Now, it's conceivable that Joe Biden has such an overwhelming victory in unexpected states, or states that I should say Hillary Clinton did not win in 2016. Let's say your Floridas or your Ohio's, maybe your Arizonas, that we will get a call on the 3rd, but that is unlikely. I have seen no one anywhere predict that Donald Trump will get more votes in this election than Joe Biden. Has anyone, Matt, Brendan, have you guys seen anybody predict that at all? Even in like the fever swamp area? Well, I mean, I suppose there's some in the fever swamps.
Maybe Trump himself at one point said if I wanted to, I could beat him in the vote. That's
right. Okay. Yes. But of course, why would you want to if you're running for president? Why would you want to? So it's conceivable that Joe Biden could get so many votes that it could end the question on November 3rd. And when we wake up on November 4th, Donald Trump is a lame duck president. I would imagine there will be lawsuits if that is the case. And I imagine there'll be lawsuits even if it is a question that the election's not resolved at that point. I imagine that November 4th is going to be a good day if you are an attorney working with the federal courts involving election. So we will see about that. But like I say, we are now 21 days out and counting. And today, of course, the Amy Coney Barrett hearings began. There was no questioning. It was all just the 22, I believe it was, senators giving opening statements. Some via Zoom because they are afraid of, or I should say concerned, or, I think being responsible is really the question of being in the same room with people who were diagnosed as getting COVID in the Trump super spreader event, and others who have refused to get tested. Now, I don't know if they have refused to get tested and actually not gotten tested, or they just are refusing to concede that they've been tested. We don't know. But I wouldn't go in that room were I a senator. But I also wouldn't go in that room because the hearing should not be happening now. And we had Democratic senators who got up there. I saw some of the opening comments. They ranged from fair to poor, frankly. I didn't see all of them. It's conceivable that there have been some that have been good, but it is very difficult to try and project to the American public that these hearings are a sham if you attend them. That's just a very difficult trick to do. And so, I heard Amy Klobuchar say, call for people who are watching the opening hearings to, contact their Republican senators and put pressure on them and tell them that it is inappropriate what they're doing. But I'm sorry, that's not going to work. There's not a mass amount of Americans who are tuning in to hear the opening statements. If you want to signal to the American public that something is a sham, then you don't participate in it. You have a press conference or you have some type of rally out in front of the Senate building, socially distanced rally, where you say, we're not going to go into that building because what they're doing is a sham. You need to show, not just tell. I'm not going to come on this program and say, this program is completely illegitimate. I do not want you to watch. It just doesn't make sense. And so, I don't know if this is just a failure of politicking, or on some level, if it is a way of the Republicans, the Democrats trying to have their cake and eating it too, insofar as they don't want there to be too much pressure on them to expand the size of the court. I mean, that's what this is very much, I think, for a lot of Democratic senators. They don't want the pressure on them to expand the court if Joe Biden wins. They don't want it. Makes sense for Joe Biden not to say anything right now because he doesn't want to alienate his base any more than he already has. A vote for Joe Biden is simply a vote for against Donald Trump for a lot of Democrats and non-affiliated voters, frankly. And so he doesn't want to alienate those people. But at the same time, there's every reason to believe, based upon his history, based upon the people that support him, Chris Coons, that they do not have an intention to expand the size of the court, which is and we'll have that argument in the coming months and weeks probably as to why I think it's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And it's a necessary thing to do, but they don't want that political pressure. And so they don't want this fight with Amy Coney Barrett they're trying to thread the needle here. They want it to activate people who are concerned about the ACA and concerned about a woman's right to have sovereignty over her own body, as well they should. But they don't want to activate people too much so that they are beholden to actually taking material, legitimate steps in the future to prevent these things from happening. We'll talk more about this. As in the coming weeks. In the meantime, couple of ads for us today. And I should remind you that if I'm up here doing a personal endorsement for a product, it's because we use it. And in some instances, we have one today. It's something that I used before we got ads for them. Because I was like, I'm using it already. I like it. Let's advertise for it. One of those sponsors is ZipRecruiter. We have someone on our staff who I found through ZipRecruiter, or in many respects, ZipRecruiter found for us. You can make your hiring easy like I did by visiting ZipRecruiter.com/majority. What happens is ZipRecruiter sends your job to over 100 of the web's leading job sites. They don't stop there. They have powerful matching technology. ZipRecruiter scans thousands of resumes, and they find people with the right experience and actively invites them to apply to your job. That's what happened to Brendan. Now, I got a ton of great candidates. I interviewed, I don't know, probably a dozen people. I could have interviewed like 3 dozen. And ZipRecruiter made it all very reasonable and manageable for me. They have an online sort of like a dashboard so you can rate them internally for yourself. So, like this is someone I want to interview. This is someone I might want to interview. This is someone I think probably I'll just file away maybe in the future. ZipRecruiter makes the entire hiring process completely efficient and completely effective. ZipRecruiter is so effective that 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. Now, I have told you, I've said this many times before, the best time to find great candidates for your job is when you don't need them, because a lot of times you have a small business, somebody says, I'm leaving in 2 weeks. You're like, wait, what? I need more time to find somebody. So go around, play with ZipRecruiter right now, get a sense of exactly what it would take to find your quality candidate within the first day. Or I don't know, for me, I found the process actually to be easy enough that I kept it going for a couple of days. Right now, try ZipRecruiter for free. My listeners can go to ZipRecruiter.com/majority. That's ZipRecruiter.com/majority, MAJORITY, ZipRecruiter.com/majority. ZipRecruiter, it's the smartest way to hire. Meanwhile, as you know, online shopping has taken off these days. Maybe there's some like major mega sites you want to avoid, but you also want to get the best prices. That used to mean, for me, in fact, I've told the story many times, I would sit my daughter down. I'm like, look, if you're going to buy this stuff, there's coupon codes out there. You search the coupon codes. And then the coupon code thing got really complicated and difficult. You'd have to try out 5 different ones. Well, now there's a solution for that. It's Honey. It's the free browser extension. It scours the internet for promo codes, automatically applies the best one available at checkout. It's basically your online shopping best friend. Here's how it works. You get Honey on your computer. You get it for free, 2 easy clicks. And by going to joinhoney.com/majority. Joinhoney.com/majority. Then when you're checking out one of its over 30,000 supported sites, Honey pops up, and all you have to do is click Apply Coupons. Then Honey searches for coupons for that site. If Honey finds working codes, it'll apply the best one to your cart. Honey has found over 17 million members, over $2 billion in savings. I've been using this a lot lately because, like many parents, I feel a little guilty about my kid being a shut-in for most of the time. Or at the very least, he's not super psyched to go out and play when he's got to wear his mask. So we've been hitting a lot of the Legos hard. And you find them at all different type of places because he likes very specific ones. Well, I don't have to worry about trying to apply a coupon code to random places that sell different building supplies and tinker sets. And you know, I save $5 here. I save $10 here. All of a sudden I got another set for him. That's at least his attitude towards it. It's simple. If you have a computer, Honey should be on it. It's free and it works with whatever browser you use. You can get Honey for free today at joinhoney.com/majority. That's joinhoney, honey like the thing that bees make, .com/majority. And lastly, this is a sponsor who I was using for, I don't know, a couple of years. And then we got him to become a sponsor. What is the perfect time to plant trees and shrubs? Well, if you go to a big box store to buy your plants or trees, they will say, don't know, or good question, or I don't know. It's actually in the fall. This is, I had no idea about this. But right now is the best time to go to fastgrowingtrees.com. All right. I have planted in the past several weeks a royalty crabapple tree. I have planted 2 toka plum trees. And I planted 2 bloomerang trees, which are like, they grow to like 6 or 8 feet tall, and lilacs and 2 different blooms. That's where they bloom and they come back. But the point is that I don't know if fast growing trees grow faster, but they're bigger. And so second year, you're getting blossoms, you're getting blooms, and in some instances, you're getting a couple of pieces of fruit. That's unheard of. These trees all showed up. They were at least from anywhere from 5 to 7 feet tall. They ship them to you. It's amazing. And that's why I love fast growing trees. And I also, a couple of years ago, I got some Hoisu Asian pear trees, and we got an Asian pear last year. 1 year out. This year, we're going to get a bunch, or next year, I should say, next spring. So look, skip the big box stores, head to fastgrowingtrees.com. It's the world's largest online nursery. You don't have to wait in lines. You don't get your car messy. Whether you're looking for shade or privacy or fruit trees, just added color for your yard, every plant is shipped with a well-developed root system. It's ready to explode with new growth, I should say, come spring. It's got a 30-day Alive and Thrive guarantee, means your plants will arrive happy, healthy, and ready for planting. So now through November 15th, got about a month, go to fastgrowingtrees.com/majority for 10% off. That's 10% off at fastgrowingtrees.com/majority, fastgrowingtrees.com/majority. All right, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to be talking to Christopher Shaw. His new book is Money, Power, and the People: The American Struggle to Make Banking Democratic. We'll be right back in just a sec. Okay, on the phone, or I should say on the Zoom, with an amazing backdrop, is historian and author Christopher Shaw, author of Money, Power, and the People: The American Struggle to Make Banking Democratic. Christopher, welcome to the program. Oh, we're having problems with sound.
Can you hear me?
Christopher, you there? Yes.
I'm there. Yeah. Glad to be
thanks
here.
for joining us. I love your backdrop. That's awesome.
You know, it's 2020. It's a tough time. You got to do something fun. So there
Well,
it's my not so great attempt.
I think it's great. And I really enjoyed your book. And of course, you know, we've heard so much about the post office. You have written a postal banking book in the past, and I want to get into that. That's something that's been one of my sort of one of my bailiwicks, I think, over the years. But let's start with, I mean, your book basically runs from more or less the beginning of the 20th century through, I guess, almost to present day. I mean, during the Obama administration and certainly the last banking crisis that we had. Let's start with the just broadly speaking, your book is, I guess, a way for us to stop limiting our imagination as to what is possible in terms of power in fighting the power of the big banks.
That's exactly right. I mean, you have these earlier generations of Americans who were prepared and took on Wall Street, and they won a series of important victories. And so, yeah, we shouldn't limit our political imagination or imagine that certain ideas are off the table, that policies are impossible, that we can't have a say in these vital questions around banking and money and finance that totally shape the economic world we live in and also the political world that we are in. So, yeah.
All right. Well, let's talk about the sort of there are two eras that you're writing about in particular where there was this, I guess you could say, a big pushback and reforms to the banking industry, and to some extent they're separate eras. They're contiguous in many respects. I mean, but for the World War II, but we're talking about the progressive era and then the era just before the Depression. We have recently talked quite a bit about the progressive era, but give us a little bit of background of it and how, you know, where this sort of, I guess, pushback against banking emanated from, because it really did emanate from many different sectors of society.
Right. So the progressive era, I mean, it's a response to the first Gilded Age, this time of incredible economic inequality and political corruption. And so it's a time when society is trying to work out all the issues and problems that it's dealing with. And so the progressive era is the moment when we are seeing ideas that are sort of a legacy from the Gilded Age come to the front in terms of banking and finance. So you have the populists of the 1890s, their ideas about things like silver, and then ideas they took from people called the greenbackers, the idea that It's possible for the government to just print money, and that could actually be money. So this is getting away from the gold standard, the idea that all money has to be gold. So that's one of these strands. You also have a real celebration of the idea of labor, the idea that it's the people who do the work who actually produce the wealth of the nation and are entitled to that wealth. Certainly, there's Christian egalitarian ideals that are important at the time as well. And then in the progressive era, you begin to have an interest in direct democracies, so things like the initiative, the referendum, and also socialism is a vital force in American politics at this time. So there's this big stew of all these ideas circulating at the time. And they all come together in this push, this idea that bankers need to be more accountable, that bankers should answer to the people, and that people should have a say about how finance operates. And ultimately, you're going to create a financial system that is going to operate more in the interests of working people and less in the interests of Wall Street.
I'm trying to hold off on asking this question in a broad way, but it keeps cropping up as I hear you talking. What was it at that time that made people, because I'm comparing it to like 2008 and to present day, where you have like consumer credit is just a complete ripoff for people. I mean, we were able to establish the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, but it was assaulted by the Trump administration. But what made people so sensitive or so conscious of the fact that the banking system, right, which is something that becomes a little bit opaque, I think, for most people, was problematic? Was it just one of the things, or was it, I mean, how broad was this understanding of how banking was problematic?
I mean, there's a number of issues at the time. I mean, in terms of economics, there's antitrust, there's a bunch of things going on. But in terms of why banking and finance was so important, is the late 19th century is this period of deflation. So grinding deflation, where essentially the price level keeps falling and falling and falling. And what this means is that if you're a farmer, you're stuck in a situation where you take out a loan to buy the seeds to plant your crop, and then 6 months later, you actually have to pay more money back than you borrowed, and depending on the length of your loan, you have to pay even more money back. And so this led to the rise of the greenbackers, and also then the populists. These ideas of finance were central as well. And this real problem with the gold standard, because if you're going to base money on gold, you're basing it on one item, and there's only so much of that item in the world, and in the United States. And when the economy is growing very rapidly, the monetary system, the amount of money, just can't keep up with that. And so, because of this deflationary spiral that went on for decades, that really clued in these late 19th century reformers into this issue. And so there's this whole legacy, this inheritance of knowledge about finance and banking that then people have in the early 20th century. And they put to good use at that time, because then this is also the time when the bankers themselves, because there's a big banking panic in 1907.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that, because that's where you start your, that's the first chapter of your book. We start with that the banking panic of 1907, or I should say the bankers panic of 1907.
Yeah, so this is, it has to do with basically shenanigans on Wall Street that go awry. And as a result, there's a lot of uncertainty in New York City about the safety of certain banks. And so you start getting bank runs, and the whole thing just goes out of control, and then it spreads all the way across the nation. And the result is unemployment shoots up, and we're in the middle of a pretty harsh depression back at the time when there aren't government programs to look after people in any ways. And so for ordinary citizens, this is another example of how finance is out of control, how finance can come along and really mess things up. And for bankers, this was scary too, because they're thinking, this got out of hand very fast, and it wasn't good for the economy at all. And so we're looking at reforms now. And so once the bankers put the idea of reforms on the table, this is where you get a grassroots politics comes in and really picks it up and runs with it and takes it in directions that the bankers had not anticipated and did not want.
So, I mean, just to be clear, it's that you have a pre-existing grassroots movement that is there and fomenting and fermenting, I guess, and simmering in many respects. And then there's this brief window of opportunity that happens, right? I mean, we're talking about the bankers' panic was what, 3 or 4 weeks long. This opened up an opportunity where bankers themselves, people who, I guess literally and figuratively have the keys to the system, and they drop their guard. And because you already have this pre-existing grassroots movement, there's like, for a moment, almost like a power vacuum. I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense of like, what the circumstances are that pushes through legislation in these moments, and how, the bankers could let this sort of get out of their control in some respect. And so can you walk through that dynamic?
Right. So what happens is the bankers after this, they want something that can come in and stabilize the economy when things start going wrong. And so they start talking about a central bank. And once they start talking about a central bank, then that opens the door to all kinds of changes. And so that's the moment also then when you get these, I think it's kind of hard for us to imagine this now, but these are just ordinary citizens, workers, farmers, people who, work through manual labor for a living. They know about this. They have this inheritance, and they know about these issues. And so they then start talking about things like having a savings bank at the post office. They start pushing back against the gold standard. They talk about the idea that the government will lend money to farmers at low rates so that farmers will stop getting price gouged by bankers. And they also have a very different idea of what a potential central bank should look like, because they think that, in fact, this should be government should basically control this bank, and therefore it would be more democratic. You'd have more opportunities for transparency and public input. Whereas the bankers, they just want a central bank that'll basically be, they will own it and they will control it. So you have very different ideas here about what this reform is going to look like. And so there's this clash over the next few years that in terms of what actually happens during the progressive era.
So what happens in that era in terms of reforms? I mean, we have reforms that come out of certainly out of the early Depression era. What is that first era more marked by simply ideas getting into the bloodstream that maybe are a little before their time in terms of when they will be adopted, certainly, or overdue, I guess. I mean, how much is adopted at that point, and how much is still sitting out there on the table, and how much does the bankers win in something, let's say, like the Fed?
Okay, so like you say, for one thing that happens, it just puts a lot of ideas on the table and gets more discussion about them, and some of them will get picked up down the road. But immediate things we see is that we do get the creation of a savings bank at the post office. So now you can walk into a post office and you can, put your money there in a savings account. It's just a basic savings account, but that's one thing. There's an act in 1910 that gets that up and running. Then another thing that we get is the beginning of.
I'm sorry, can I just interrupt for 1 second, because this is really important, and I think people just are amazed by this on some level, because it seems so fantastical when we talk about postal banking in this era. That lasted for 50 some odd years, right?
That's
You could get a bank account at the post office for 50 years in the first half of the 20th century. That's
right. Yeah, more than half a century. You could walk into a post office and open a savings account there. Absolutely. Yep.
All right. Well, we'll circle back around to that when we get up into the 1960s, so that we can talk about why that ended and why it shouldn't have. But continue on with the other reforms that came in that era.
Right. So other ones is you get the beginnings of a farm credit system. So this is the government is getting involved in making sure that farmers can now access affordable credit. So this is actually considered to be really a breach of the way that business and government should interact. So this goes through in 1916. And then between these two reforms, you also get a number of states erect bank deposit insurance or deposit guarantee programs, so that if the bank fails, you can get your money back. And these states are mostly in the Great Plains, but this happens in the state level. The big thing on the federal level we all know about is the Federal Reserve system gets enacted in 1913, and it's up and running shortly after that. And in terms of how does it look different because of grassroots political engagement, well, the thing that is really different is that the bankers thought they would essentially set up a central bank. They would probably own it, they thought, and they would definitely exert control over it in terms of the governing board. And what we end up with is a system that is, it's more decentralized than they wanted, but also you have a governing board of the Fed where the members are presidential appointees who are then confirmed by the Senate. So this principle of public authority over the nation's central bank is enshrined in the Federal Reserve Act, and that is not something that the bankers had wanted at all.
Now, with that said, it's not as democratic, I think, as they wanted, and certainly I think on some level as many want today.
Right.
But it is not as I guess private or I say distinct from political pressures as they wanted it to be. And we can return to that. But so we're in between these two eras of the major banking reform, and I think more comes obviously following the beginning of the Great Depression. But let's take this time to sort of stop and talk about a couple of the figures that were really prominent then. As a kid, I used to go into the Worcester Center Galleria and shop at Filene's basement all the time. I had no idea who Edward Filene was. Tell us about him.
He was a wealthy businessman, as we all know from the stores that still exist, but he was also very progressive-minded, and he's trying to think of ways to make basically the economy operate so that it will treat working people better. And he decides that one way to do this is to bankroll a movement to set up credit unions in the country. So credit unions being banks that are owned by the depositors and controlled by them, and they get to elect the people who run these credit unions. So he's the big force in terms of putting up the money that allows the credit unions to get organized. And now this is probably the most important example of cooperative enterprise that we have in this country today. And he's the one who really paid for that to happen.
So he gave them basically, the functional equivalent of bridge loans to start up these enterprises. And what was it about him? Like it's hard to imagine a businessman at this point who is, or maybe that's unfair on some level, but I don't know. What was it about his history or the tradition he was coming from that saw that as important?
There's a bunch of these kind of self-made businessmen in the late 19th and early 20th century who, this is a time when there's a lot of conflict between capital and labor, right, between workers and their employers. And they're all kind of searching for ways to ameliorate this, to make these differences less stark and reduce industrial conflict. And he's one of these people. I mean, workers are turning to unions at this time. These employers tend to be looking for other things, and so this is where Filene gets behind the idea of the credit union and starts the organization that goes out and helps workers to organize that. But this was definitely something, businessmen, major industrial leaders were thinking about at the time.
Well, just to be clear, so he's doing this to let the air out of like the tires, as it were, of some social movement.
I think that look, I don't want to. I'm sure that he had good intentions and things like that, but this is also a time when there are more radical proposals and possibilities out there, and a lot of these businessmen are looking for something that's a little less far-reaching. So
I guess what I'm trying to tease out is that we have this dynamic of the capitalist class, if you will, seeing that there is enough turmoil that they need to do something to head off certain movements. Maybe they're doing it because they're nice guys, and maybe they're doing it because they have interests, or maybe they're doing it because they think it's better for society, whatever it is. But they are compelled to introduce these reforms, which are in some instance good things, maybe don't go far enough, but more positive than what existed before. And it's in direct relationship to the threats that they see to the status quo, as a way of like saying, okay, let's go to status quo 0.20, as it were, or 2.0, as it were, because we're not going to be able to sustain status quo 1.0, and we will end up at status quo 4.0 if we don't basically offer up 2.0. I mean, that's the dynamic that we get when we go into, in many respects, into the Great Depression.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, there's, for instance, there was a shoe company called Endicott Johnson Shoes, and they gave all their workers a square deal. Well, if the workers hadn't have had the possibility of joining a union, if there had been all these other things going on at the time, probably the square deal would not have looked the way that it did. So, yeah, I think you've described that dynamic very well.
Okay, so let's also talk about Wright Patman for a little bit. I've read a little bit about him, but and heard things. But give us a sense of who he was and what he represented to, I guess, this broader notion of banking reform.
He was from East Texas. He was, grew up in a log cabin from very humble origins, and he was definitely influenced by this populist tradition, and particularly concerns about monopoly. So this idea that there's these vast corporations that have inordinate influence and power over the economy and over politics, and we have to find some way to curb them and bring them to heel. And particularly, he was interested in how this played out in the world of banking and central banking. And so he was very much interested in doing what could be done to curb the power of Wall Street. And he really devoted, he was in Congress for decades, and this is kind of his pet project, his pet issue throughout that time period, from the 1930s all the way up until the 1970s, actually.
Also, I mean, while we're here, I guess let's talk about Huey Long as well in that era before we move into the beginning of the Great Depression at some level. He started tell us about Huey Long. He started his own sort of, I guess, the share of the wealth. So this idea of wealth inequality, it's not what's old is new again, or maybe has never gone away in some respects.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so Huey Long is a politician from Louisiana. I mean, he was gets a lot of power there, creates kind of political machine. We see authoritarian impulses there, but he did actually have a real political agenda. And the reason he had political support is because he was interested in transforming the lives of poor Louisianans and making them better. So as governor of the state, I mean, he builds roads, he builds hospitals, he makes education more available. He does all of these things. And then when the Depression hits, he says, hey, the main issue here is the wealth is not distributed nearly as broadly as it needs to be. So he starts something called Share Our Wealth Society. And, share our wealth, that sums up the idea. Basically, you're going to have taxation in ways that are going to make it so that ordinary people would have a lot more money and the really wealthy just could not get any richer. And he's also then worried about the role that banks play in this economic inequality of the time. So he gets involved in that in the early years of the Depression.
And he is initially supportive of FDR, but then critical of FDR from the left, feeling that his first set of, I guess, New Deal reforms did not go far enough. I mean, just talk about that dynamic, because many of the things that he was talking about ended up getting instituted. I don't know, many, but some of the key ones became instituted later. Just talk about that dynamic.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there are a number of figures that are to the left of Franklin Roosevelt, and they're constantly pushing him. And Huey Long was probably the most prominent of them because he has a national profile. He basically is the political king of an entire state. And, his main thing is share our wealth. And Roosevelt responds directly to this with a tax that they called it a millionaire's tax that's targeted directly at really the wealthiest people in America. And you also hear in a lot of the rhetoric then that Roosevelt starts to adopt leading up to the 1936 election, that he is identified that the share of wealth, the economic inequality that Huey Long talks about is something that voters are hearing. They're worried about it, and he begins to adopt some of this language and also some of these policies.
And so let's talk about what we see following. I mean, in those policies. I mean, specifically with some of the, we get FDIC, we get Glass-Steagall. FDIC is, we have this idea that exists in the states. I guess I don't know if they called them SDIC, but they were basically states deposit insurance corporations, as it were. And then this gets federalized to protect small depositors, relatively small depositors, I guess, money in these banks and to prevent bank runs, et cetera, et cetera. What else comes out of this? And then let's talk about how what happened from this moment where you have these banking reforms and this sort of like greater awareness of the power of banks. Then it's really just sort of like a slow degradation, really, until you get to the 90s when, all shackles are off essentially. And there seems to be a loss of generational memory of the problem that can happen when banks have too much power and too much over basically our lives, our economy.
Yeah, the FDIC is probably one of the most underrated reforms that we have, because prior to the establishment of the FDIC in 1934, if you are someone who has a savings account or a checking account, you were constantly worried that the bank might fail and you might lose, if not all of your savings, then a good portion of them. And so this injects a lot of instability into the system, because anytime that the economy starts to have problems or that you begin to have questions about the safety of a particular bank, you could have a bank run. And this could quickly escalate to the situation where you have a full-blown banking panic. And this can create a depression, or it can make a depression worse. And so the FDIC really goes very far to stabilizing the economy. And so you'd have like regular depressions that banks either caused or magnified like every 10, 20 years ever since the 19th century. And this stops after the FDIC. And this was a reform that actually bankers at the time said would really be the end. I mean, this was going to have terrible consequences, and it ends up being entirely the opposite from what they thought. And so the people pushing for this, I mean, it wasn't academics, it wasn't anybody like that. It was workers and farmers. It was grassroots people who were worried about losing their money, and also thought that this would be a way to stabilize the banking system, and they were right. Well,
there's a couple of things I want to point out here, because I cannot tell you the amount of conversations I've had over the past 10 years. Well, it's not that many. I don't know that many bankers, but it's enough, where I've talked to people in finance and whatnot, and they say, look, government regulators, they don't understand. They don't understand this stuff. It's too Byzantine for them. They don't understand. They're cloistered. They don't get it. And that's their excuse as to why there shouldn't be any reforms imposed upon them. What did the bankers at that time, what did they fear about the FDIC? What obligations did the FDIC put on them, as opposed to it just being just straight out like the government's going to backstop you in some way?
Yeah. So what they claimed is, this economic concept of moral hazard, the idea that if, basically they said, hey, bankers are really going to take advantage of this. They're going to do all kinds of corrupt practices if they know that they can get away with it, because the government is going to come in and backstop them. That's what their objection was. They also had this kind of ideological objection that, like, you need to research a bank before you put your money there. And if the bank isn't good, then you deserve to lose your money if it fails. I mean, this sort of laissez-faire
this is a very libertarian concept that we hear from libertarians, where it's like, if you need to bone up on banking practices and audit the bank before you deposit your paycheck in there, as if you have a lot of time and expertise to make those assessments of banks. And that's in between when you go out and get your electrician's, when you become an electrician to know if your housing is okay, is your electrical's right, and your so on and so on. But yes, that is a very libertarian concept. And so they had an ideological problem with it. Did they have any, was there any imposition upon the banks in this instance from the FDIC?
Well, yeah. So what they, the other thing that they didn't talk about as much is the fact that there was additional regulations. Basically, the government now is, the federal bank examiners are taking a lot closer look at the books and are watching them a lot more closely. And then also they have to pay a certain amount of their deposits into this insurance fund as well. And they constantly, once it's in place, and they want to reduce it, they want to pay less money into it. So, it did interfere with their businesses, and they definitely didn't like that aspect of it. But they did tend to come back to this libertarian idea that we should all, be experts on banking, like you said, before we put any money anywhere. And if we aren't, then we deserve to pay the price for that. And that's kind of a moral obligation almost that we should pay the price for that failure on our parts to not have checked this out thoroughly before we decided to put our money in a bank.
How much of that was because ultimately the FDIC, right? It makes you feel more comfortable about depositing your money in the bank, and then it allows the bank to lend more money out. I mean, it's almost like, I don't want to push the analogy too much, but it was like, you can't force us to have higher CAFE standards for our cars. And then we end up innovating better cars, and they figure out they can do it, and it helps in terms of their sales, or light bulbs for that matter. You can't force us to make more efficient light bulbs, and then they do. And within a couple of years, the light bulb industry is fine and more robust in many respects. And that's what happened with the banking. I mean, obviously, they don't want huge cyclical, I guess what they call non-secular, cyclical depressions and recessions and whatnot, or enhanced, recessions. So, I mean, how much of it was they also don't want to set a precedent that government can actually go and that the economy is not like an animal that exists in the wilderness and functions, by itself, that the economy is actually constructed, that we make that there is no such thing as the economy in and of itself. It is always a political economy. It is always a construct of a society in some way. And this sort of is like a little bit of a clue to people that, hey, government constructs this, and it's just a question of how they're going to do it. I mean, how much of it was that?
I think that out of the various businesses aren't always, like, American business isn't always in agreement about policy and politics. But I think out of all the different sort of divisions within business in the early 20th century, it was the bankers, the people in finance, who were the most laissez-faire, who were the most kind of insistent in the idea that if government gets involved in the economy, there will be bad results, and this is just the wrong thing to do. So there's definitely this ideological element where these bankers do not want to have government involved in there. And what they would say is like, hey, the economy has been growing really strongly for, a long time here, and it's because you've let us alone and let us do what we do. This would be their claim, and they believe this very, very deeply.
And they held on to these beliefs till we get, we lose postal banking, and I presumably because the banks don't want the competition ultimately, and they want that business. They know they can get those deposits and they can get those fees that are associated with it, et cetera, et cetera. This grows, and then we get into the 90s and we lose Glass-Steagall, where it just opens up more avenues for banks, commercial banks, to mix with investment banks, and they get more money so that they can leverage more money, presumably. And then we get something like 2008. There was like it's sort of like the delayed kidney punch. You pull back the regulation in the mid 90s, and then the real damage happens 12 years later or so. We just have a couple of minutes left here. Do we have anything in terms of broad-based grassroots movements or any political leaders that you see that are analogous, and where do they from this era, and where do they rate relative? Because I'm just convinced that despite we had that 2008 financial crisis, there's just not the broad-based awareness that existed in the late 19th century, early 20th century, because you had so many people who were farmers who were dealing with banks like this. Like, I think like the experience of small business coming out of the PPP may, sort of like get people to understand, like, oh, wait a second, if I was a bigger client, I would have gotten this money, or it would have been easier, or whatever it is. But there doesn't seem to be the broad-based understanding of the role that banks play. And there doesn't seem to be a politician. Elizabeth Warren, I think, is focused on these issues a little bit, but there doesn't seem to be a politician who is capturing the imagination of people around this issue as much as in that era.
I think you're right. I mean, but I would add to that I started researching this book back in 2006, right? So this is before 2008. And the learning curve has been pretty impressive that I've seen, ever since 2008. I mean, people are learning very fast. And it's true, you don't have like a Wright Patman type figure who has this inheritance to draw on and is engaged in this for decades here. But you do, like you said, have someone like an Elizabeth Warren who's informed on this, Bernie Sanders talking about these issues. Even the Republican Party in 2016 in their platform said they're against too big to fail banks. Now they have the exact same platform in 2020. So, I mean, it's an idea. These ideas are out there in a way that they weren't in the late 20th century, and I think that is hopeful. But it's true. It's not to the level that it was in the late 19th and early 20th century in terms of just the knowledge of the average citizen and the grassroots engagement. That's not where it was, but it seems we're moving in that direction, and I think it's happened pretty fast, really.
I know this is outside maybe your portfolio, but what would it take to get there? Like, I mean, is it just that we have a different dynamic in our politics today, and it's going to have to be a smaller sort of group of activists who are a little bit more surgical, or what? I mean, how do we get a broader based awareness about these things?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one difference is that back then you just had more sort of civic engagement in like local organizations that then were part of larger national movements. And I just don't think there's as much of that these days. But I do think that the more people are engaged, are talking to each other. I mean, that's where it starts. It starts with discussions, right? I mean, that's how you learn about these issues. That's how you inform yourself. That's how you settle on an idea of what reforms need to happen. And then that's how you go forward from there and decide which tactics you're going to use to try to implement these reforms, to try to actually realize them and make them a reality. And I think that, these discussions are happening. People are learning about these issues. This stuff is underway. But we'll just see how it plays out. And sometimes it's happening faster during moments of crisis. But even when that's not going on, I think that there's sort of these deeper discussions that are happening where people are going to be more prepared the next time that these kinds of issues are right at the forefront of our attention as a nation.
Well, Christopher Shaw, the book is Money, Power, and the People, the American Struggle to Make Banking Democratic. We will put a link to that at majority.fm. Thank you so much for coming on to the program today. It was fascinating stuff.
Thanks for having me. I appreciated the discussion.
All right, folks. We'll be back in just 1 minute with some updates on what's happening with the Amy Coney Barrett hearing, and also with Donald Trump's COVID tour. We are back. So Donald Trump is back on the mail-in ballots argument. Again, this is. I mean, I think at one point it was Plan C for them. I think Plan A was to try and beat Joe Biden by saying that Hunter Biden and Joe Biden were involved in some type of massive scheme with Burisma. That seemed to have fallen apart, in part, not in part, probably very much a function of impeachment. In fact, I think it shows the power of impeachment had the Democrats been a little bit broader in their approach to this. We would have seen, I think, a very different dynamic than we've seen since then. And of course, Plan B, and I think, Plan F was probably try and win more votes because it was so out of reach, I think, for Donald Trump. But we'll see. But Plan B is to simply say that the vote tallies that we're seeing are fraudulent. And this one's been in the works for a long time. We will talk in the second hour about the Lincoln Project a little bit. They're in the news. But I want to remind everybody, when Donald Trump was talking about how the results from California were very dubious, which led to his 3 million vote deficit in the popular vote, it was Paul Ryan who was also stoking those flames, who was out there saying it was very suspicious that Florida was bringing in these mail-in ballots. And that was 4 years ago. I mean, so this has been a long-term project. I mean, the Republicans have been doing this for decades, of course. But I just want to make it clear that it's not just Donald Trump, that the Republican Party does this part and parcel. And those never Trumpers, they were doing that 4 or 5 years ago as well. So, but here's Donald Trump Saturday at the White House. He spoke for less time than was anticipated, and he did it from his balcony. This, of course, is not a campaign event because that would be illegal. But here he is just talking about generally mail-in ballots.
I think so. And you're going to see that. And you see how many crooked ballots are being found and turned back in and fraudulent? Just what I said. Then they'll say, he doesn't believe in freedom. I totally believe in freedom. That's called freedom. What we're doing is freedom. Tremendous problems with the ballots. 50,000 in Ohio, 25,000. You have to see it. I mean, every day there's a story about ballots. Some thrown out. They happen to have the name Trump. Military ballots were thrown out with the name Trump on them. Okay? But I think we're going to swamp them by so much. Hopefully it's not going to matter. And we have law enforcement watching. We have law enforcement watching all those ballots. They're being found for a reason. Left-wing politicians like Kamala Harris, who really did not do very well the other night. By the way, did our vice president do a good job, Candace? That was...
He is addressing Candace Owens there. She is the head of the Blexit movement, and where Black people are to not vote for Joe Biden, but rather to vote for Donald Trump, I guess. What's interesting about what he says there, he just throws out these numbers, 50,000 in Ohio, and then pivots immediately to the ballots that were found with Trump's name on it. And what he was referring to there were the 6 ballots that were found out of 9 in a Pennsylvania office. Not 6,000, 6 ballots. So he just seamlessly pivots. Like, they found 50,000. Did you hear a bunch of those were Trump ballot? No, that was not the same ballots that he's talking about. And, you know, he is, I don't know what the threat is there, implicit in the idea that there's police officers or law enforcement watching, but that's what we have. So there's Donald Trump's plan B. He is out there hoping that that he can convince his supporters that and I should say that those 50,000 ballots, just being reminded here, were all in Franklin County, which is a large blue county. And these were absentee ballots that were put out with wrong names or whatnot. And theoretically, there have to be more ballots sent to them. And hopefully that can be made up, but we will see. These aren't actually ballots that have been filled out. But we will talk more about this. We are 21 days away from the election. We will talk about the Amy Coney Barrett hearings the next hour. And of course, we will be talking about those hearings tomorrow as they get underway with questioning from members of the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. So we will say adieu until tomorrow for those of you who are listening to the first hour of this program. For those of you who are not, who are sticking around, join us in the so-called fun half. Just a reminder, this program relies on your support. You can become a member at jointhemajority.report.com. Also, don't forget the AM Quickie. A lot of people are talking about it. We have, you can get 6-7 minutes of headlines every morning. We're getting it out earlier and earlier, so you can be on top of what the day will bring in terms of news. amquickie.com or wherever your podcasts are served. And don't forget, justcoffee.coop, fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code MAJORITY, get 10% off your coffee. Nomi's show is not happening today. It started, she goes Tuesday through Friday at 3 p.m., but you can check out the Nomi Key show on YouTube and see what she had last week if you missed any of those programs. Also, don't forget the Antifada. You can find that over at patreon.com/theantifada. Matt,
I'll bring Jamie in here.
Oh, is she here? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in the meantime, why don't you tell us what's happening on TMBS, Matt?
I am not actually sure what we have for TMBS, but yesterday for patrons, Napoleon the Legend and Leisha Brooks sat down for an hour-long conversation, so people should check that out. That's up on YouTube for patrons now, and it'll be up for as audio for patrons later.
Oh, shit.
Jamie?
Can you hear me?
Working. Yes, your sound is working, yes.
Does it sound like it's coming through my microphone or through my...
No, it does not at all.
God damn it. All right. I'm going to have to restart some stuff during the
You sound good enough for the plugs, though.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right.
The plugs. Yeah,
right. All right, I'll do it. This week on the Antifada, Sean and I will be going over some news, and then we will be expounding on the very topical topic of left communism. Lenin called it an infantile disorder. We call it kind of interesting and cool, maybe outdated as a political tendency. What even is it? We're going to go over all of that. And if you have any questions or critiques about left-wing communism that you would like to send us beforehand, you can do so right up until tomorrow, because that's when we're recording. So patreon.com/theantifada. You can email us at antifadamindset@gmail.com, or, just DM me like people are wont to do. Also, our episode from last week is still good. I don't even remember what it's about. Patreon.com/theantifada, folks. You'll love it.
All right. We're going to take a quick break. Head into the fun half. 646-257-3920. 646-257-3920 is the number. We'll be right back after this.
In for it. All right, folks. 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back. Boy, back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you can imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy, back. And the alpha males are back.
Just want to degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Almost has what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
I am a total cunt.
Can we bring back DJ Dennerky's song, please?
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Dennerky.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break for people.
That's fucking nonsense.
Hey, folks, reminder. I do not have Parkinson's.
And the alpha males are...
Psych. Fuck 'em. Almo says what? Almo says what? Hell of a lot of bank. 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 Hell of a lot of bank.
All lives matter. Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
The alpha males are back. And the Africans are black. Africans. The alpha males are back. And the Africans are black.
See Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100. Can't knock the hustle. Come on! Fuck 'em. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday! Happy birthday to me, Jew boy! I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are back. Africans are black.
Come on! Come on! Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
We are back.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, you sound much better.
All right, great. You know what it was? My goddamn robot vacuum.
You gotta get rid of that thing.
Over a
That thing is
cord.
taking over your whole life.
It yanked my whole setup off of the table that I have and also broke a candle, and there was glass everywhere. And I was more concerned with cleaning up the glass from the floor. I didn't really check on which cords had been unplugged. That thing's going to be the death of me.
Apparently. It's like having just a rabid pet in your home.
Yeah, well, it's practice for when I have children.
Yes. Except for you can take that thing outside of your house and just leave it outside.
I just turn it off.
You could just leave it out in the front and just have somebody take it away.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, let's get to it. There was only straight on opening statements during the Amy Coney Barrett hearing today. Mike Lee is, of course, here without a mask in two different ways. One is he does not have a face covering as he's speaking because, which is an issue because he was recently diagnosed as having COVID. We don't know his status right now. He looks a little clammy to me, but he often looks clammy. So I want to be fair. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. Then the other thing, the other mask he took off, he also sort of had dropped the other night when he tweeted out some rather undemocratic, and I'm talking small d, undemocratic sentiments on Twitter, saying that you don't want ranked democracy to rule us. And here he is sort of fleshing that idea out where here he is discussing his theory about the Supreme Court in American life.
We have to remember that we've got three distinct branches of government within our system. We've got two that are political. The legislative branch, where we work, where we make laws. The executive branch, headed by the president, where the laws are executed, implemented, and enforced. And, of course, the judicial branch, where you work, where the laws are interpreted, where people come to disagreement as to their meaning. The branches are sometimes referred to as equal. I don't think this is the best description of them. I think the best description of them is that they are coordinate branches of government, meaning they each exist within their own sphere. They're not equal in the sense that the least dangerous branch was, is, always has been, and always will be the judicial branch, for the simple reason you can't reach out. You can't decide where we're going to go today or tomorrow. The judiciary is confined solely to those cases and controversies brought before your jurisdiction.
This is a bizarre sentiment when you consider that they decided an election in 2000 that really shaped the course of, I mean, in many respects, world history over the past 2 decades. Certainly the course of history for millions of innocent victims of our invasion and occupation of Iraq, among other things. I mean, there's a lot of other things. It is an amazing a statement to make in terms of just the Supreme Court's history in shaping our society and the fact that there is absolutely no recourse in many instances from a Supreme Court ruling. I mean, I guess there's Congress could, in statutory cases, could go back to the drawing board. But this is a stunning thing to say. Pop up his tweet from the other day. The idea that, first off, that the democracy isn't the objective. Liberty, peace, and prosperity are. Now, I think I'm assuming he's saying prosperity. We want the human condition to flourish. Rank democracy can thwart that. And, well, I mean, the real question is, like, who gets to determine what liberty means? Right? I mean, we have the FDR version of the 4 freedoms, which involve actually providing for people, having society provide for people so they are not subject to the inherent lack of freedom that's involved in a society like ours, not having health care or not having any type of resources, not having a place to sleep, not having the ability to feed your kids. And I guess in Mike Lee's perspective, he decides, or buddies of his, or the Supreme Court. It's both a lie that the Supreme Court is not political and a disturbing perspective. Democracy is not the objective, but it is the most effective way of assuring that society works for everybody. It's not in any way completely effective. How could it be? Nothing is.
It's not completely democratic either.
Democracy.
The way that we have it.
Well, I understand, but he's not talking about necessarily our society. He's just talking about the general concept of democracy. The idea that you would give, I don't know what rank democracy is. I guess that's when you give people, all people, the ability to influence how society functions. But I guess that's what rank democracy is. I don't know what, you can't look up in the dictionary and find out what rank democracy is. It's just his
democracy too far.
Yeah. His perspective on when things get really democratic. I mean, so this is a guy who would love to go back to the days where people didn't vote even for their senators, where they were just appointed. This is a guy who wants to go back, and I would imagine would want to go further. I mean, this is the libertarian perspective. Ultimately, when you drill down into it, which is that, and this is, you go back and you read about Mont Pelerin, and you understand what the dynamic is. It is freedom that you get to enjoy. It's just that somebody's got to define what it means, and we shouldn't leave that up to everybody.
Well, this is what the whole Nancy McLean Democracy in Chains, the project of those guys are. It's to create constitutions that basically lock in, the property classes, basically.
Well, I mean, go back and listen to my interview with Walter Block, who is the professor who, used to advise Ron Paul. I think it was the second interview where he talks about this concept of property rights. And conveniently, the entire construct starts after white people have come and taken the property from the indigenous people who are working the land, which is the big thing. And he goes, well, it starts basically around that time because we brought the idea over from France. And it is just completely unsound. And it has to be. It has to be because they have decided that we're going to have an arbitrary, we need freedom once it's determined, and we need liberty once it's determined by a small group of people what that is. And then everybody can enjoy it. But if you set it up that way from the beginning, you've put it on a path where it's going to lead to specific outcomes or even general outcomes that are in a specific direction. As long as you basically say, we're only building roads that go north to south, and you are free to travel wherever you want on these roads, then you know that it's going north to south. And if we end the road the southern way, then you know everybody's going to head north.
That's pretty convenient for them.
And it's very convenient for them. And I would say that north is exactly a direction, I'm just arbitrarily picking it like they do, except for it's not completely arbitrary. It just happens to be like where, for instance, they own the property. And so they get to charge rents on it. Mixing metaphors a little bit, but the idea is you go north because that's where they still retain the power. It could be south, east, west. I'm just using north as an example, but that's the whole dynamic that Mike Lee is shrouding in this concept of liberty. It's liberty as long as we define the starting point and the direction you're heading in, and then you get to enjoy all the liberty you want because we already know we're going to win.
Yep. It's also kind of weird that he's saying he's using this argument that the judiciary isn't that powerful, because why are they trying so hard to get people on the judiciary then?
Right. It's not that powerful, except for we're going to literally do what we diametrically opposed 4 years ago. What was it? 1,200 days ago, we were out here saying there's absolutely no way you could seat a justice when we are 9 months out from an election, because we need to give the American public a chance to speak. We have already had hundreds of thousands, if not millions of votes cast at this point. Now, it's quite possible in our polarized era that it doesn't matter who the Republicans appoint to the Supreme Court, to those voters. That would not have changed their perspective whatsoever. But it's very conceivable that 5, 10,000, 20,000, 100,000 out of literally maybe millions of votes cast at this point would have changed their opinion about whether they want the Republican Party, if they're going to put someone on there who's going to make it impossible for women to have sovereignty over their own bodies, if they're going to put somebody on the Supreme Court who has already publicly, come out and said the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional. I disagree with what the Supreme Court has ruled in the past. Someone who has already come out and given an indication as to the vision that she has for society. I mean, the last election was decided by 70,000 people. And this is a pretty, and certainly 3 weeks ago, no one contemplated the idea that Amy Coney Barrett would be sitting on the Supreme Court. They were holding, they were holding nomination, sort of parties for her before Ruth Bader Ginsburg was buried.
Yeah, I've been skeptical as to whether this is going to move the needle for anyone who would ever vote for Trump to begin with. But, like for better or for worse, it might with those suburban moderates. Like, just using an anecdote of one, my friend's mom is a lifelong Republican, and she also considers herself a feminist. And when my friend brings up, the abortion issue, she's like, well, he would never do that. He would never actually do that. So, like, I wonder what she thinks now.
Right. That's so much of the Republicans' game is that like creating that doubt that they're not really doing that. That's exaggeration. That you have derangement syndrome.
Later this week, I'm going to go through some of the studies that have shown when focus groups get the Republican agenda, they don't believe it. Like, they literally look at it and they're told it and they go like, that's not what they're doing. Not like they're misinterpreting. They think it's all just like, you're joking. They can't.
There's stuff they say to get people to vote for them.
I mean, there's we're trying to get Rick Hassan on. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get him on, but he's written a piece that he thinks that the American public has no real concept of what's going to happen with a 6-3 conservative court, and I would agree totally with that. I don't even think the majority of the politically astute people who actually pay attention to this stuff really have a concept of just how the range of things that will change in our daily life because of a 6-3 court. And I mean, it's, you know, I think it's a massive failure of anywhere from the center left to throughout the entire left to not, you know, look, it's not a question of supporting the existence of an institution as much as it is like it exists and it implicates so many aspects of our lives that it's important to be aware of it. If you want to prevent this stuff from happening, I mean, it's on some level, it's like you may not want it to rain, but you should really be aware that you're going to need an umbrella. Yeah. And I don't know. I had a professor in college who was a government professor, and when he got out of college, out of law school, he I think took a job with the Peace Corps. And I may have the details of this wrong, and probably should not necessarily get them completely accurate. But the general gist of it was that he ended up lawyering for I think what was an American territory where the military wanted to do tests of nuclear weapons. And he was successful in preventing them from moving forward with that as a lawyer. And when I was thinking about going to law school, and I should say he ended up becoming rather conservative in many respects. I think he was. I think the government had done some things to him that he didn't like after that. I'm not exactly sure. I didn't know the details, but when I was contemplating going to law school and going to a school that focused on critical legal studies, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but he was saying, like, look, go and learn how to represent your clients so that you can win, because you can study about how the law should change. But if you want to actually have a material benefit for people, go and figure out how to win within that context. Now, I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. And I think you need to have a vision for where you want to change things. But you should not individual, right? I only have so much time to get into the theory and so much time to sort of like practice. You know, I guess some people have more time or less. But broadly speaking, as ideas that work in our society, we need to, as a movement or as people who want to help other people and create a better society, we need to be able to sort of hold these two ideas in our heads at the same time. That some of these institutions need to be weakened, if not in many instances eradicated. But at the same time, when they're not weakened, they need to be manipulated and influenced in such a way that they don't immiserate more people, and do so for, I mean, the Supreme Court was a malignant force in this country for, 80 years at different times, maybe more.
And it was designed that way.
Anytime you have like 6 or 9 or 8 or, however many, a few people you have, it was designed, like the Senate was initially, to represent the views of a very limited group of people. And there is no way that such a small, limited group of people can not just represent, but even have empathy to the lived experience of so many others.
Yeah, and a group of people that was appointed like 30 years ago.
What's that? What do you, I mean,
if you're looking at
yes.
a lifetime appointment, you've got
Right.
people who,
Right.
you know, they
Right.
get appointed
I mean,
once.
It's not just that they're limited. It's that like they basically like, we're going to freeze you as to where you are in your notion of how society should operate. And then we're going to put you in a bubble for the rest of the time you're there.
It's so many layers removed from democracy. Might as well be on the moon.
Exactly. Except for the problem is that they have like a little remote control device that influences everything down here.
Yeah, well, they influence the tides, they influence the decisions. It's like a whole thing. That's why we got to blow it up.
Now, the counter argument to mine that the Democrats should not have shown up at this hearing to illustrate to the American public that something's very deeply wrong with this hearing. The regardless of who the candidate was, they could have nominated Merrick Garland again. They could nominate Pam Carlin, the left-wing professor from Stanford, to the Supreme Court, and this hearing would be unjust and inappropriate based upon their own rules. The only way to communicate that to people, in my mind, is by not showing up, is by standing outside of those doors and saying, like, I could walk in those doors, but I will not, because what's happening in there is a sham. The counter argument to that is you're not going to stop the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. There are people watching this. It can be used as a way of leveraging it for electoral purposes. I don't agree with that theory. I think it's also what it's doing is sort of letting a little bit of air out of the tires so that they're not as pressured to reform the court if Biden wins. Nevertheless, here's Sheldon Whitehouse executing the strategy in the opening remarks of the Amy Coney Barrett hearing that basically tries to turn the hearing into an argument about the ACA, because the fact of the matter is, in 2018 and I think in 2020, the Democrats do better when they run on the question of healthcare.
America's worried about one thing above all else right now, and it's our health. This hearing itself is a microcosm of Trump's dangerous ineptitude in dealing with the COVID pandemic. Trump can't even keep the White House safe. Here it's the chairman's job to see to the committee's safety. And though his words were reassuring, I don't know who has been tested, who should be tested, who is a danger, what contact tracing has been done on infected and exposed senators and staff. Nothing. The whole thing, just like Trump, is an irresponsible botch. The irony is that this slapdash hearing targets the Affordable Care Act. This Supreme Court nominee has signaled in the judicial equivalent of all caps that she believes the Affordable Care Act must go and that the precedent protecting the ACA doesn't matter. The big secretive influences behind this unseemly rush see this nominee as a judicial torpedo they are firing at the ACA. So I hope Republicans consider what's at stake for the many people who depend right now in this pandemic on ACA health coverage. Rhode Islanders are calling, writing, emailing, tweeting me by the thousands asking me to say no to this nominee, mostly because they too see her as a judicial torpedo aimed at their essential protections. And my constituents want you, my colleagues, members of the Republican Party, to stand up for once to Mitch McConnell and to the big donors who are driving this process, and for the sake of regular people, say stop.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. But that is the strategy that they they are deploying here at this hearing. Almost every Democratic senator basically did a version of that. And I don't think it's going to be terribly effective, but in communicating that, I mean, I just don't understand. If you think something's a sham, how can you argue it's your job to show up for it? That's the definition of a sham. It's something that I shouldn't show up for. Let's go to the phones. Calling from an 847 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Hey, it's Josh from Chicago.
Josh from Chicago. How are you, Josh?
Good. How are you? Lashana Tova.
Thank you very much. Happy New Year to you as well. I am fine. What's on your mind?
So much. I wanted to talk about. I mean, I largely agree that people should. I have my ballot right here because I just got it mailed. I'm voting for Biden on the Working Families Party ticket. I think people should vote Democrat.
You're voting in New York, right? That's where there's fusion voting. There's a couple other states,
Yeah,
I think, where they have something like that, but I'm not sure about.
Yeah, I think Oregon has something like that as well. But don't quote me 100% because I'm not 100% sure.
I never do.
Okay, good. Anyway, so I agree the Supreme Court matters, but I am also someone who believes whose politics are pretty close to Jamie's in a lot of sense, and I believe in Supreme Court abolition. I believe in abolishing these institutions, maybe as like a long-term project. And especially looking at the issue of defunding and abolishing the police, I look at defunding as a step towards abolishing the police.
I mean, just to be clear, when you talk about abolishing, abolishing the Supreme Court, you're going to need a constitutional amendment.
Right.
We will all be dead. We will all be dead.
Probably.
Well,
I plan
there are a few different ways it could happen. Sorry to butt in. Continue.
I plan to live to a ripe old age, but besides the constitutional amendment, are there also reforms that we can take in a similar route to defunding the police that we can take towards the eventual goal of abolishing the Supreme Court? Even like court packing, for example, I think could be used as like a step towards abolishing the Supreme Court, just because you're showing how it's actually not a neutral institution,
right,
and we shouldn't pretend that it is.
Right. Well, I mean, there are things you can do. You can limit their jurisdiction. You can impose term limits. I mean, there's some questions as to, constitutional questions on this. Part of it is just, and maybe it is a question of who is the head of the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice. You can expand the size of the court. I mean, which would be a perfectly reasonable thing to do when the Supreme Court, the number 9 was not an arbitrary number. It was presumably to match the number of circuit courts, federal courts of appeals that existed at that time. There were 9, and now there's, I think, 13 if you include one other sort of federal court of appeal that is basically considered on that same same level of the circuit courts. I mean, so there are ways of I think doing it in that respect. Term limits, increasing the size of the court, and limiting their areas of jurisdiction, I think are all arguably constitutional enough anyways. I mean, look, we had for over a year only 8 justices on the court. I mean, if you can do that If it's constitutional for the Senate to do that, and they were arguing, reminder, the Republicans were arguing that if Hillary Clinton got won the election, they were prepared to not provide any hearing for her Supreme Court nominees for 4 years. I'll tell you the complete lunatic Republican who was out saying that. John McCain.
I remember
John McCain, the maverick, the old style Republican. If only the Republicans were like John McCain, then there would have been no Supreme Court justice for 5 years. There would have been 8 Supreme Court justices for 5 years. They tried to shrink the size of the DC Circuit Court. I mean, let's not pretend that the idea of changing the number of judges on a court and doing so in a transparent way, in a direct way, as opposed to the indirect way the Republicans did, isn't somehow, a radical idea. It is not. It is a response to the idea that, like, look, okay, you've just announced there are no norms anymore. And so will it diminish the power of the Supreme Court? Republicans get in, they control, both branches of the government besides the judiciary, and they expand it even more. Yes, it will go back and forth. And maybe someday there'll be a time where people are like, this doesn't make much sense. We need to limit the importance of the Supreme Court because it is destabilizing society. It's conceivable. It's also conceivable that we will just get used to it and there will be 13 judges, and that's the way it works. I mean, we don't know. But that's that. I think, short of a revolution, which presumably would kill a bunch of us anyways, and short of,
first wave, all of us.
Right. Well, I mean, my point is, it's not the abolishing of the Supreme Court is honestly like, I think it's just, I mean, it's a fine idea to have in your head from a theoretical standpoint, but it is bonkers to believe that that's going to happen in our lifetime.
Yeah, probably not in our lifetimes. I would say it's along a similar horizon to abolishing the police, which is to say it is it's a revolutionary horizon, but maybe not. Maybe abolishing the Supreme Court is less far off than abolishing the police, because I feel like we could still have the other branches of our government functioning and not have a Supreme Court.
Yeah, I mean, but there's a constitutional amendment. You would have to literally get rid of a huge swath of the American public. I mean, abolishing the Electoral College is a very hard thing to imagine. Abolishing the Supreme Court, it is bonkers.
Lincoln had the better approach, which is like,
it is much more likely that climate change will disrupt our society in such a way that the Supreme Court is largely irrelevant or is relegated to, by armed guards and being told what to say and issue edicts. That is far more likely than the idea of abolishing the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
I mean, tend to think it's a massive, massive waste of energy and time to base anything on the idea that the Supreme Court's going to be abolished. And all it does is it diminishes the opportunity that may exist in this very short window to reform it in such a way. I mean, this is also part and parcel of my frustration about the complete lack of understanding about what kind of crap storm we're about to head into with a 6-3 conservative majority on the court.
Well, didn't you just say that there's no inherent conflict between reformist ideas and the long-term project of revolution?
There is no inherent conflict between it, but it can interfere. And I think in this instance,
there's an order of operations.
To mess up that sequence, yes, it can interfere. There's no inherent conflict. You can hold that idea in your head. But when you present it as an option in this window, you are squeezing out. I mean, just look at our conversation here. Like, we are so sidetracked from anything that is even remotely possible to happen, that we are losing the fucking thread here completely. But I appreciate the call, John.
Language.
I know. I just find it really aggravating because I don't think there is a fully internalized notion of what is, like how much worse. I mean, just think even like the notion of like, arbitration in the context of labor cases, like just how disempowered people are now by the Supreme Court, what they just done with a 5-4 majority on stuff that very few of us even have a vague notion of. And to honestly be saying like, but Santa Claus may come and fix everything is okay. You've said it. Santa Claus could come and fix everything. But now we got to get back to the point where there is no Santa Claus.
He is a fat bearded man who wears red and gives things to people. Clearly pretty communist.
He very well may be, but at least he's like keeping it under wraps until he knows the right moment. Mo on the IM, what was the arrows in the quiver that Pelosi was talking about? Was it just bullshit? I don't remember the specific context, but without knowing the specific context, I think deferring to the answer yes is probably a safe one. The Dems are just cucks, but I appreciate how Biden's not answering the court packing question. Well, I mean, I don't think he should answer the question, frankly. It was funny to watch Ben Shapiro tweet out today, like, Joe Biden has such disdain for journalists and they still love him. I mean, dude, who is that talking point for? Like the people who are going to vote for Donald Trump are like, oh, I don't like a presidential candidate who has disdain for journalists. I mean, and like, how stupid do you think the journalists are that you are tweeting at, that you think you're going to inspire them to get more aggressive with Joe Biden? I mean, Donald Trump has literally put a target on them. I mean, for violence.
He's got to meet his tweet quota, though.
Exactly.
Well,
I'm going to put that on my stupid tweet page.
Let me just ask you, what would happen if Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were like, hell yeah, we want to pack the courts. We want to balance out all the reactionary psychopaths the Republicans put on there in illegitimate ways and vote for us, and we'll do it.
It would make it easier for us to hold them to account for not doing it. The reason why he's not doing it is because he's not saying it. It's because he wants the flexibility of not doing it. Joe Biden doesn't want to do it. And he doesn't want to say that because he doesn't want to get us angry about it. And what it does do, though, is it keeps the door open. Because Joe Biden's not necessarily in charge of how people react. So what they do is they want to manipulate the way that people react to this. And so they on one hand say this is a sham, but on the other hand, they don't act like it's a sham, because if they did, they would push this, or they could push it, or they could either create so much outrage that it would force Biden to reform the court, or they could slow things down to push it into the lame duck era, period. If Biden wins and the Democrats take the Senate and Mitch McConnell does this in the lame duck, which I'm convinced he would, the political price that he would pay would be huge. I mean, you would have normies go like, wait a second. They didn't win anything and they're putting this person in. That would put so much pressure on Biden to reform the court. They don't want that pressure. People in power do not want pressure. It doesn't always work against them, but they just don't want it. They want a free range to do whatever they want to do. And so he doesn't say anything, in part because he doesn't want to say that he's not going to do it, because he doesn't want to piss off part of his base. And he doesn't want to say he's going to do it because he doesn't want to be in any way have any constriction or on him going forward. And so it's like, it's incumbent, and the Democrats in the Senate, in my estimation, there's a little bit of kabuki theater here because they don't want to push the outrage. If they wanted to push the outrage, they would be standing out in front of the Senate right now. And they would be saying, like, we're not walking into that building, not just because of the COVID, although that's one issue. But the main issue is that this is a sham and we don't participate in shams.
Yeah. I was just trying to clarify that you don't think it would lose him any votes to say he would pack the court. It's mainly he just doesn't want to have to do anything about it if he wins.
I mean, I can't imagine it would cost him any votes. I mean, I guess it's conceivable, but I think highly unlikely. I just don't think people pay attention that much to this.
I think they're so afraid of giving the Republicans something to talk about. I wonder.
I mean, I think that's part of it. Although they're talking about his refusal to answer, but that's more of a process question. But I mean, I think like largely speaking, if the Republicans go, listen, if the Republicans go out there and say like, he's going to pack the court, people have to say like, why? Oh, well, because we lied last time when we filled the court. I mean, you don't need to know why. I mean, that's the thing is that, I mean, the reason why he's not saying it is because he doesn't want to do it.
Then why doesn't he want to do it?
Because they're institutionalists. Because he doesn't. I mean, the only thing that could possibly influence his decision to do it would be because they're institutionalists, and the only because, well, there's two reasons I think. The only instance when he would do it is if he's trying to pass modest things that pass through the Senate, right? I mean, look, think about Andrew Cuomo. Why did Andrew Cuomo want an IDC? Because he wanted a limiting principle. He wanted something that would limit him, that is theoretically outside of him, from taking any steps that would run contrary to his, you could call it class interests or his corporate interests,
big donors,
his big donors, whatever it is, or his own personal interests. Who knows? His own ideology. And the Supreme Court, in some way, set up to act as not just a control on Joe Biden's, agenda. It is set up so that Joe Biden doesn't have to pretend like he has a control. Look, there's a story about, I'll illustrate this way. Why would Joe Biden be hesitant to have a Supreme Court that was going to okay any type of changes that he was to make politically, as opposed to one that would shut down the ACA and shut down any type of replacement or shut down any, who knows, a whole myriad of things. Why would he want that? It's the same way that this story of Dan Sullivan in Alaska illustrates this. If you want to know more about Pebble Mine, you can Google Shannon Moore. You can either find interviews that she has done over the years, or you can find ones that we did with her on this, that we ran on this program for years. This was an issue. It's Bristol Bay. It is the source of the greatest amount. I think it's the largest single source of seafood for the country that exists. And there's this enterprise that wants to build a copper mine there. And they've been at this for 10 years. And she tells an amazing story at one point on the show that she had met with some of these attorneys for this company that was looking to create this copper mine. And she thought that she had the perfect sort of like argument for them to see how irrational, how dangerous this mine was, and that it wasn't necessarily even valuable to the company. Can't remember the exact argument, but she was convinced. And she sat down with them, and they were rather frank with her. They said, it's not just about this mine. We're worried about setting a precedent. So it doesn't matter how unprofitable this mine would be. None of that matters. We're worried about the precedent that's being set if we don't do this because of the EPA. So, and there's a lot of concern in Alaska. Like, people are attached to their biggest fishery in the state and one that provides seafood for the rest of the country. And so it is not healthy for you to be a politician and be totally on board with the idea of Pebble Mine. And So apparently Dan Sullivan has been out there, and as Lisa Murkowski, they've been critical of it. They haven't like completely shut it down and slammed it, but they've been critical of it and said, we don't really have much influence over it and blah, blah, blah. But apparently what happened is some activists recorded secretly a conversation between these undercover actors who had pretended to be potential Pebble Mine investors and Pebble Limited Partnership CEO Tom Collier and the head of its parent company, Northern Dynasty Minerals CEO Ronald Thyssen. In those tapes, Thyssen made clear to the fake investors that the company would aim to expand Pebble further than was already they had already applied to build, which contradicted Collier's written testimony to the House Water Resources Environment Committee. But also what came up in that was they started talking about Sullivan. And on Sullivan specifically, and I'm reading this from the Intercept piece on this. On Sullivan specifically, Collier had said the senator, who had been notably vague on Pebble, was hoping to, quote, ride out the election and keep silent on the project. I think that's our plan to work with him. Leave him alone and let him be quiet. Thyssen said they were trying to work with Sullivan by allowing him to say critical things that didn't offer explicit opposition to the project. This is the dynamic that politicians want. They want to be able to be seen to be championing something and having some outside force actually be the thing that is preventing them from doing it. So why didn't Andrew Cuomo sign progressive legislation in one of the bluest states in the country? Because of this renegade group of Democrats who wouldn't allow anything to pass through the Senate. Now, he midwifed those. He arranged that whole caucus to exist. But most people didn't know that. So he could just say it's their fault. It's not my fault. If you sent it to me, of course I would look, I would have to look at the details and this and that, but I'm completely open to it. It's those guys who are preventing me from doing it. And I think
that's trash.
I think to a certain extent, Joe Biden has that same attitude, and Democrats, broadly speaking, I think this is, in many respects, part of human nature. They don't want to be blamed for things that they don't want to have happen. If you're a politician, not happening. And so you blame other entities. And I mean, I think there was hesitation when Obama was president to actually have a supermajority in the Senate, because then you lose the opportunity to blame some other entity.
So in that case, do you see, I'm thinking back to the Matt Stoller tweet we shared a few weeks ago about the best way to delegitimize the Supreme Court is to pass legislation and actually wield power. Do you see a Democratic administration with a Democratic Senate actually passing anything that would get to the Supreme Court and possibly be stopped there? Or would they just go small bore until then with the 6-3 court?
I mean, I think they will do that. I think they, but that's a long process.
Yeah,
I think, before you get there, what you have to do is you have that same battle with the filibuster, right? I mean, that's why they're so hesitant to get rid of the filibuster on some level, because they lose one arrow, or a reverse arrow in their quiver, which is we can't pass that because of the filibuster. Now, what will happen is some politicians, Democrats, will become the fulcrum at that point. But if you have 55 Democratic senators or 60 Democratic senators, it's going to be hard for them if there's no, if you have 59, it's going to be hard for them if there's no filibuster, because all 9 of those, not all 9, but maybe, are going to want to be the ones who are courted to have their vote be the up or down vote, right? This was John McCain's favorite moment in his entire career. Look at me. I am the one who's controlling this. And they all want to be there. And they will position themselves there. And it's really just a question of can you put enough pressure on enough of them that they can't be the fulcrum in their state? I mean, that's why John McCain built the whole maverick, sort of narrative around him. when in fact he wasn't that maverick. But he built that narrative because it allowed him to position himself in such a way that he was always the fulcrum.
Yeah, and if it does get past the filibuster, like the 6-3 court, they're not going to care if it's like social democratic policies or just tepid incrementalism. Like they're going to block whatever the Democrats try to do, which kind of reminds me like one more reason why this kind of centrist liberalism is dead. The contradictions are heightening. Like Joe Biden's version of liberalism, right? The ACA, they're going to treat that like it's socialism too. And he won't appoint the judges to save the ACA because he's afraid that they might let single payer go through.
I don't know. I think you can find a lot of judges who will uphold the ACA. Well, I don't know. I mean, that's possible.
On a 6-3 court?
Well, no, on a 3 court, you won't. I mean, I think that, they'll, I don't know what they'll do to chop away at it. But
you got to pick a lane. That's my only point, right? Like the middle path is a dead end.
Well, I mean, not necessarily for their careers.
No. Yeah.
I mean,
for the world though, and like politically, in all the ways that matter to people other than them.
No, I agree. But a lot of these people just operate on their own agendas. This is great footage. Here's footage of Mike Pence at a rally in the Village's senior community in Florida. Incidentally, Florida reported over 5,000 new cases yesterday. Now, it's possible this is a combination between Sunday and Saturday's reporting. Nobody's quite sure yet. This stuff filters through the system. But what is clear is that there was over 3,000 more infections this past week than there was the week before. That is the wrong direction for infections. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Florida, there's a lot of senior citizens there. They are very, very vulnerable to this disease. I think we're about to see a bit of a spike in New York, frankly, over the next 2 or 3 weeks. And I think it's going to be sustained. I don't know that it's going to be what it was in the first round, but you start
get your
to see
indoor
numbers.
dining in now, folks.
Indeed, or not, and maybe stop it. But we have reports where was it Osterholm, the one of the premier epidemiologists in the country? We had him on the program several months ago. Has said what was the actual quote that he said about Florida? That it's about to
a house on fire.
Florida will be like a house on fire in weeks with loose coronavirus restrictions, says Osterholm. And here is Mike Pence bringing his COVID road tour to, of course, a senior citizen village, as it were. But have no fear, folks. I see at least 2 or 3 people out of that crowd of hundreds wearing a mask.
Jeez.
It must be nice to be that impervious to COVID. Here's more footage. Oh, there's one other person with a mask. Let's see. Is that a kissing booth? Is that a kissing booth they have there at the COVID rally?
Wouldn't put it past them.
Unbelievable. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Are they working for Democrats?
Well, I mean, look,
trying to spread it to the villages.
I don't know if that's probably going to happen.
Seriously, they had a pretty good episode of Chapo about the villages, and I would never wish death on anybody, but if ever there were a concentrated group of people who constitute a negative force in American politics, they're definitely there.
Well, I mean, it's a little conservative in its worldview, this idea of personal responsibility, and but one would like to can mean your death. One would like to see our leaders who supposedly have access to the top public health officials in the country model and suggest certain behaviors that would not lead to the deaths of maybe thousands, hundreds, tens of thousands. We don't know. Here is Larry Kudlow going on and saying that we're learning to live with the virus. And I guess presumably that means we all now know that everybody in the White House can be airlifted to Walter Reed and get experimental drugs that are not available to anybody and would bankrupt the overwhelming majority of Americans in this country. The overwhelming majority of Americans in this country to get this kind of health care.
And businesses are reopening. We are learning to deal with the virus in a targeted, safe, prevented way. So it's not dependent. All I'm saying is some targeted assistance would go a long way.
We're not learning to live with the virus, Larry. We just had 4 days in a row of more than 50,000 infections. The death rate is the highest in the world. But let's focus on the economic aspect, because that's your area of expertise. I guess I
just want to say,
yeah.
Just Jake, just 1 second. I want to clarify. Living with the virus. Look, 5,000 experts just signed a petition. Led by people from Harvard, Stanford, Oxford University. These are scientists, these are doctors, these are healthcare workers who say we can deal with this virus going on while we're getting new therapies, we're getting new vaccines are coming around. It's not just living with the virus. As long as we protect the most vulnerable, as long as we preserve the key guidelines, yes, we can get through this. We are not going to shut down the whole economy again. There is no reason for that. We will take care of the vulnerable. That's the key point.
Well, there's so much that you just said, but again, I had you on to talk about the economy, not healthcare matters. In terms of obeying by the key guidelines, I mean, you might want to tell the guy in the building behind you, but that's a separate issue. Let's talk about
that. Actually, is exactly the issue. If you read the petition that he's talking about, it is presuming a completely different reality than exists right now. It is basically saying, if we had wings, we could fly. The fact of the matter is, when Mike Pence goes and have a rally amongst senior citizens in Florida, where the vast, overwhelming majority of those people are not wearing masks, in a state that top epidemiologists are saying it's going to be like a house on fire in weeks. The idea that we don't have to take these draconian measures as long as we can maintain key guidelines. We can't maintain key guidelines. We do not have the ability to maintain key guidelines. We do not have the political leadership in this country to maintain key guidelines. To maintain key guidelines, you don't only need just, some your leaders modeling certain behavior. You need the ability to pay people to stay at home. You need the ability to provide material support to people in a way that this government has refused to do. You need to provide funding for cities. You need to provide funding for states. You need to provide funding directly to your citizenry. You need to provide a whole host of things that our political leadership has refused to provide for its people. So there is no way to maintain key guidelines. That is a fiction. That is a fantasy. And I mean, so it's like, that if is so looms so large that it's almost bizarre. I mean, I understand, I understand that scientists are, a group of scientists are convening to say that. And Fauci has been more or less saying a similar thing. It's like, we don't have to lock down if we do certain things. But that we are not doing those certain things. There is a government that is standing in the way of doing those certain things. There's a whole political party that is right now marching into a Senate hearing room with at least one guy who was found to be COVID positive. We don't know if he's contagious now, with one or two other guys who are refusing to get tests. That if is so massive that it's impossible to climb over. And so, good for Jake Tapper laughing in Kudlow's face. But,
Well, I mean, look, if Trump insists on cutting a red swath of death through the Chud Belt and killing his own supporters, I mean, we tried to stop him, right? But it might have some silver linings. That's all I'm going to say.
I don't know. I don't know. I wish people had, I don't have I don't have faith in people's awareness for it, frankly. I mean, do you remember that clip of that woman that I think it was Michael Shore did for the Young Turks, where she's like, yeah, no, I know 2 people who died from COVID. I know it's real, but I'm at home with my 92-year-old mom. We don't wear masks. I don't, because I think it's overblown. What? Calling from a 478 area code. Who's this? Where are you calling from?
Good afternoon, Sam.
Jeff in Georgia. What's happening?
Hey, man. I wanted to talk about Mike Lee a little bit. Actually, you already talked about it a little bit, but I'm actually totally fascinated by this rhetoric. Literally undemocratic small d stuff. Because Sam, somebody emailed or I am show on Friday tried to call me an MR knockoff. I just want to correct the record. I'm actually reporting for Michael Brooks knockoff. Hopefully that sounds like a DC. Thank you very much.
You're breaking up a little bit. You're breaking up a little bit. It's hard to hear you for some reason today.
Oh, I'm sorry, Sam.
That's
better. I'll try to start walking around. I was just saying, I'm more of a Michael Brooks knockoff than a Sam Cedar knockoff, just for the record. At least that's what made me want to start my show with Michael. But on my show, I really like history. And when I listen to Mike Lee talk, he sounds exactly like straight up monarchists from like 17th century. like literally that sort of reactionary. And the thing about like politics, quote unquote, at that time that really alarms me about the situation mirroring that today is that back in those days, like we tended as a species, humanity, when I say we tended to fight things out a lot more, like literally. And a lot of these political notions really became motivating factors for violence in order to perpetuate a hierarchy and establish the status quo as unbreakable. That was the point of the people who talked like that, because these people were literally like courtiers. They drew salaries like from the crown. It would be their job to sit around and think about why democracy sucks.
Right.
Because it would mean the end of their power. And when I think about the Supreme Court, I mean, I think the point really is I mean, like abolition is good because like it sucks, but really like we don't have a lot of time left. I'm convinced our institutions are within a generation away of being basically totally illegitimate in the eyes of most people. And governing us will look like it did in the 17th century. People with guns, more or less. Now, the tech will be better, right? And it'll be far more insidious and connected to the internet. But it's going to boil down to violence. And what we need to do, first and foremost, incredibly soon, is stop the Supreme Court from acting as such an undemocratic institution. It needs expansion, and it's not going to get it. Like, they're not going to do it. I'm sorry. Like, I just don't see that happening. Not in the next 4 years anyway, and I don't know when it's going to happen after that. Like, we talk about abolition or whatever. That's such a huge lift. How are we ever going to get that if we can't ever even get them to talk about expanding the court by, like, give me a number, 3, 4, 5 seats. Like, let's start haggling. We can't even get to the table. Like, we're in big trouble. That's how I feel, Stan.
I mean, I would say the odds of Supreme Court expansion are very, very low. Very, very low. I mean, because you're going to need to do it to the extent that there's any sort of like political will to do it. It's going to be it's only going to exist in the first 6 months, right? I mean, as soon as Breyer retires and you fill that Supreme Court seat, you've lost any of the political pressure to expand the court, in my estimation. And the process of them striking down, anything that Biden tries to do is will take so long that you'll be outside of that window. So I would tend to agree with you. That's why, I think like the best shot was that you would maybe generate enough outrage if they sat her and confirmed her during the lame duck. And that's probably, it does not look like that can happen now. And so that ship has sailed, and we will have a 9-person Supreme Court, and we will not know for years, on signature pieces of legislation, if there are any that come out of a Biden administration, that they are found to be unconstitutional. What will happen is you will see things like, oh, the EPA doesn't have the ability to determine what constitutes clean water anymore. So now clean water actually means that you can have, this or that chemical into it because Congress didn't say you can't have that chemical in it. And you'll have banking regulations that are even more unwound than they have been at this point. Because the EPA will know that, like, or I should say that, whatever the various regulatory agencies will know that we don't even have the authority to execute these things. Never mind the resources that it takes to fight the corporate lawyers that, tie us up for months or years in an attempt to write these regulations. I mean, it will be a crap show. And for the most part, it's going to be stuff that is too opaque for people to be able to say, like, oh, this is a function of the Supreme Court. I mean, you don't know these things. You don't, I mean, by you, I mean, like all of us, we're not even aware of in our daily life how much of our right for redress on even things like almost like fraud that we have lost over the past 4 or 5 years. I mean, you look at everything that we're talking about every single day. We talk about these voting rights issues, all a function of the Supreme Court, with the pre-clearance.
Just as a matter of time, like a lot of this sucks money out of the working class, which means materially they have to spend more time looking about how they're going to survive, or like let alone provide for a family. God forbid if they have to do that, right? And this is going to require just, hours and hours of labor on their part. You add sleep into that, kids, like they don't literally, their ability to fight this stuff will be diminished by the very institutions of the Supreme Court itself, which means like, I feel like the longer this goes on is the longer they are allowed to stand in the way of any sort of challenge by what passes for democracy in this country. It's going to make things harder and harder, which is why like abolition is great, but like we need to do something very quickly, and things that we can do quickly. I mean, theoretically, anyway, we could expand the court quickly.
Yeah,
but
we'll see.
Like, not going to happen.
That is, I mean, that.
Happy to be wrong about that.
I agree. I agree. I think that is I think relatively speaking, that is a huge lift. I mean, that's why, like, in my mind, like, to talk about abolishing the court is literally like, don't worry, folks, because the jetpack that I have that will actually be physiologically part of my body will allow me to do some skywriting that will get the movement going. I mean, like, it's so fantastical.
I don't dunk on your plans.
Well, I mean, I am more than willing to have plans dunked on, with some type of, I'm not saying that there's something. I mean, I just, if you can make the argument to me that within, that there's a path for even 50 years from now, 100 years from now, that doesn't involve, a far larger issue of complete collapse of society as to the abolishment of the Supreme Court.
It does.
In this. Well, but then that's irrelevant anyways.
And it
then it's
probably will.
Just everybody pick up a machete and deal with that. Then the Supreme Court, nobody's going to be the Supreme Court doesn't even need to be abolished. I mean, that's my point. Is that that there is, if all of this is going to be resolved with a complete collapse of society, then there is no point in doing anything other than sort of making plans for that.
Look, we are trying to prevent a complete collapse of society. All right. I think capitalism has run off of a cliff. It hasn't started falling yet, but the system is in the air and it is only a matter of time. The idea that things could even remotely keep going as they have been for 50 years without some sort of collapse, I think that's the unrealistic pie in the sky thing. What we are trying to do on the anti-capitalist left is to prevent a civilizational collapse before that happens, because it is going to happen.
I am not
no matter what
the intent at all. I am not impugning the intent at all.
I just think that the road to court abolition is better and more achievable if court expansion is on it. And limiting its jurisdiction is on it.
This is
then I'm worried about what happens after that collapse, where there's a vacuum because the left is not really positioned.
We are so far. Yes, I agree. But we're so far from that. But I agree with you. Like, the more that you actually impose reform on an institution, the more you're signaling that it's broken. Right. And you need to signal and show that it's broken before there's any hope in any type of change. And so, I mean, it's the same reason why I'm arguing they shouldn't go into that hearing room. You can't say it's a sham and then show up and do everything like you normally do. It just doesn't. It means that sham doesn't mean what I think it means. Like, you just don't show up, and then you're basically signaling there's a real problem in that room. And
do you like Star Trek, Sam?
I mean, look, I watched a lot of the movies. I watched obviously the original Star Trek. There's a couple.
Kobayashi Maru situation, I think. They've already screwed it up. Like, there's nothing they could do. I don't think there's anything they could do with that hearing that's going to really make a very effective response. The Democrats, that is.
I mean, I'm not saying that it's going to lead to specific results as much as I'm saying is look, when you have when you've got a 14 at the blackjack table and the dealer is showing a 7 or an 8, you need to hit. You need to hit. That's just.
I grew up in Biloxi, Sam.
Well, but you know that you need to hit. It doesn't mean that you're going to win. It doesn't mean that you're going to win. It just means that you need to hit. You need to take a hit. And because there are, and that's what I'm suggesting here, is not necessarily that it's going to lead to a better outcome, but I do think that it would create more political pressure. And I think more political pressure is better than less political pressure. But their agenda is different. Appreciate the call, Jeff.
I just want to say one more thing. Right. One more thing about the violence that Jeff brought up, right? The idea that our government will become increasingly undemocratic so that it must be maintained with violence in the future. That's already happened for a whole bunch of people. It's already happened for everyone, but certainly for some more than others, right? This system needs violence to maintain itself, whether we're talking about the people in ICE prisons or we're talking about the people who get killed by the police or just, locked in jail and having their lives stolen from them that way, or the everyday violence of exploitation. You have to sign up to be exploited by a boss or else you starve to death. The threat of starving to death, that's implicit violence. So the idea that yes, violence could certainly get worse, but that violence is already here. The idea that we could somehow have no violence if we avoid revolutionary violence is just not true. The violence is already here for so many people. I also think you underestimate the amount of time that we have left, honestly, before a civilizational collapse occurs. And we're trying so hard. We're trying everything. We have to try everything. We have to try what you're saying. We have to reform the courts. We have to try what I'm saying. We have to build a vast working class base capable of challenging the power of capital. But In the end, we might not have that much time. That's all I'm saying. I don't think it's that crazy an idea.
There's nothing that you said that I disagree with. I don't disagree that we don't already have violence in our society. Of course we do. And I didn't say that there's going to be a lack of violence at any time. I think it's, I don't disagree with anything you just said. That's different than saying that. I'm just saying that, like, with that limited time, if it's a finite resource, how do we expend that resource? And the way that you expend that resource, in my mind, in an effective way, is to look at goals that are obtainable with those finite resources, right? And so, so, because otherwise, you don't know what to do with those finite resources.
I mean, I think both of our goals are difficult to obtain in different ways.
Well, I guess,
but I think there's a problem when one is wait till capitalism collapses. Like, that's not really.
I don't want to wait. Like, I think we need to be building this revolutionary project as fast as we can on the off chance that we can change this system to a new one and un-F the world before a total civilizational collapse occurs.
Listen, I mean, I the point that we just made with the interview that we had about banking reforms that took place. You had a ongoing movement, and then there was a crisis, and because that ongoing movement had already developed like solutions and a perspective on this like sort of like a simmering crisis, when it hit a boiling point, they were able to move in and get some reforms passed. Not everything, but the Fed was not as the bankers exactly wanted it. It's still not sufficient. It was 100 years ago. And so that concept I appreciate and have no problem with. All I'm saying is that the idea of reforming the court is not only, I think, more likely than abolishing the court, because of the obstacles. Getting a constitutional amendment is much harder than having a Senate vote to expand the size of the court. That is just simply a fact. And there's also an argument that I think Jeff was making that sequentially, it is almost impossible to get to the idea of abolishment without having reform and showing that the institution is flawed and not stuck in amber. And so that's the argument. Everything else is not the argument. That is the only thing that I'm suggesting.
Yeah, well, some people can work on that, and other people can work on this longer term project that
fine.
I think is actually has the potential to solve the underlying problems here that are causing all of these problems.
Let's go to the IMs. I don't think we're going to have time to get to any more calls, folks. I'm sorry about that. We will try and do more this week. I promise. So don't hang on anymore, because we only got a couple more minutes left here. We'll do some IMs. Let's see what we got here. Here is Lindsey Graham. Here's Lindsey Graham arguing, and this is from his opening statement. I missed this. This is interesting. And this, again, there is a small reed of hope that there will be enough outrage generated by this appointment of Amy Coney Barrett that it will push the Democrats to reform the Supreme Court. Like I say, small reed, and it's certainly, I think, the Democrats are attempting, in many respects, to lessen this outrage, because it is a catalyst to change that I think many of them, not all of them, are reluctant to take, just because that is their nature. You don't get to the pinnacle of a hierarchy of power and then decide, like, hey, the structures maybe are unfair. No, because you're there. I mean, I think, I mean, I've been talking about this long enough that I think I used Wade Boggs as the example, who was a third baseman for the Red Sox, I don't know, 20 or 30 years ago. Wade Boggs, one of the best hitters that the Red Sox had produced, pure hitters, not necessarily the most unselfish player, but pure hitters. And the idea that Wade Boggs would get to the top of his batting game and then promote the idea that, like, you know what, we should really change the rules here and people should kick the ball instead of hitting the ball is absurd. He's not going to strike at the heart of a system that has taken him to the top. I mean, there's moments in history where you find people like that, but that's just simply unlikely. But here's Lindsey Graham acknowledging that, in fact, they may be ultimately confirming for reals Amy Coney Barrett after the election, in which case it's quite possible they'll be doing so knowing that Donald Trump is not the president and that Lindsey Graham will not be the chair of the Judiciary Committee.
This is an election year. We're confirming the judge in an election year after the voting has occurred. What will happen is that my Democratic colleagues will say, this has never been done, and they're right in this regard. Nobody's, I think, has ever been confirmed in an election year past July. The bottom line is Justice Ginsburg, when asked about this several years ago, said that a president serves for 4 years, not 3. There's nothing unconstitutional about this process. This is a vacancy that's occurred through a tragic loss of a great woman, and we're going to fill that vacancy with another great woman. The bottom line here is that the Senate is doing its duty constitutionally. As to Judge Garland, the opening that occurred with the passing of Justice Scalia was in the early part of an election year. The primary process had just started. And we can talk about history, but here's the history as I understand it. There's never been a situation where you had a president of one party in the Senate of another where the nominee, the replacement, was made in an election year. It's been over 140 years ago. I think there have been 19 vacancies filled in an election year. 17 of the 19 were confirmed to the court when the party of the president and the Senate were the same. In terms of timing, the hearing is starting 16 days after a nomination. More than half of all Supreme Court hearings have been held within 16 days of the announcement of the nominee. Stevens 10, Rehnquist 13, Powell 13, Blackmun 15,
Why is this relevant
Berger 13.
if it's constitutional? Why even bring that up?
All I can say is that I feel that we're doing this constitutionally, that our Democratic friends object to the process. I respect them all. They'll have a chance to have their say. But most importantly, I hope we will know more about how the law works, checks and balances, what the Supreme Court is all about when this hearing is over.
All right. So there it is. You know, Lindsey Graham is basically laying out the speech that if the Democrats take control of the Senate, the next, I guess it will be Dianne Feinstein, Lord help us, the next chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, you could read that speech. Our Republican colleagues will say that it's wrong for us to reform the court, to expand the court to say the traditional, to its original intent in its size, which is to match the number of federal circuit courts that exist. But it is constitutional, so we will do it. I mean, that is the speech. He is saying there is no norms, there is no hypocrisy, there is no statements that we can be held to from the past. It is what it is. Now, do I think the Democrats are going to do that? Do I think Dianne Feinstein is going to do that? If I had to bet, I would bet no. Is there a slight chance that there will be enough awareness from the American public and enough push from the, left of center of this country, which is, I think, more than half this country on some level, who will push back, even if it's just because of sort of, issues as to like healthcare and a woman's sovereignty over her own body. Maybe. And that's what I think, we're going to have to try and gin up and create that level of pressure, because I think the Democrats are trying to diffuse that pressure. And, I think we need to focus like a laser beam on that, because otherwise it's just not going to happen. And there's going to be a whole host of things that we're going to spend the next 20 years talking about that cannot happen. And then I don't know what happens at that point. I mean, climate change, Green New Deal,
civilizational collapse.
Maybe.
Sorry to be a doomer.
Huh?
Sorry to be a doomer, but I'm the one who also thinks that it might be avoidable.
Well, I think it might be avoidable.
I also think it's avoidable.
I think it's like, I mean, I think it might be avoidable too. I just think that like, that's not a plan. Like, I think like there's, it's one thing to be prepared for stuff and to build these things, but it is another to say like, that's plan A.
It's not the only plan.
Well, I know it's not the only plan.
I think what we're talking about is certainly a good plan in the short term. I think its power to avoid a wholesale collapse in the long term is very limited.
I am fully in favor of when there is a limited window to exercise plan A, that you focus on plan A. That is my approach. The antipasta. Can you ask Matt when we can expect his next 9-hour Twitch stream? Mormon Apocalypse Now.
I wonder where my first 9-hour Twitch stream was.
Would like to hear your
Actually, I left it on. Sorry.
Would like to hear your thoughts regarding the Pinkerton employee being a Majority Report fan. I am not aware of that. Speaking of violence, I think people would like to hear MR's thoughts about Pinkerton employee and MR fan who shot and killed a MAGA chud on Saturday. I will look into that. I know that that's a Pinkerton employee. Spencer Williams, Josh is correct about Oregon having fusion voting, so you can quote him on it. There you go. Shelby, you can rotate SCOTUS justices back to the circuit courts and still give lifelong positions. Yeah, that was a, I can't remember the name of the guy who proposed that plan. But at one point, I feel like, was it Ford? Was it Matt Ford? I think he suggested that. When they make the ACA unconstitutional through this activist court and the people start dying and going bankrupt because of it, maybe then the Democrats will gain the will. Yeah, that may be a while, though. Asking McGee, could the Supreme Court abolish the executive or legislative branches? Sorry, dumb question. Never mind. No, they cannot. I just voted in Atlanta, Georgia for the first day of early voting. It took me almost 4 hours. Wow. Well,
the lines in Atlanta are crazy, like 6-hour waits, they're saying.
Well, good for you folks who are waiting in line in Atlanta, and just it's appreciated. And it's absolutely absurd, but it's appreciated. Empire Burlesque, put 35 new justices on the court, 9 random judges per case. I like that one too. Bernie's Sandwiches. Hey, Sam, you should treat Jamie like you do libertarians and stop freaking out every time she talks about aspirational shit. It's just as important as your in the weeds shit if you don't want a completely deflated movement. You're the one who's always railing against Dems for starting in the middle with a negotiation, but now you're in the middle. It's bonkers. I'm sorry. That is not calling for Supreme Court reform as opposed to its abolishment is in the middle. Like, I'm not negotiating with anybody. There's no negotiations. I'm not at the table. I mean, it's just an absurd analogy. The Democrats are literally negotiating. They actually have something that is present and material in the moment. And I should treat Jamie like I do libertarians.
Geez.
I don't think that's.
Thanks a lot Whoever said that, I am.
JJ Cool, hey Amar, I don't mean to stir the pot, but I have to ask who Jamie thinks will arbitrate the decisions if the Supreme Court was demolished.
The people.
The people courts will. The People's Court. I saw that. Rube David, has anyone watched For All Mankind? It's a series on Apple TV that's what if the Soviet Union got to the moon first in the space race that never stopped. The Americans seem to be accurately portrayed as constantly in fear of the Soviet Union for no good reason. I have not seen that. James Darwin, I think Biden should answer the court packing question. I think he should say the minority party in this country has already packed the courts through obstruction and election interference to advance an agenda that most Americans don't support. I don't think remedying that is packing the courts. I think it's preventing judicial apartheid.
That's the Abraham Lincoln approach.
Mm-hmm.
If Bingo Mosquito, if Hillary was president right now, we'd have a 7-justice Supreme Court right now. If Hillary were reelected in 2020, the court would continue to be unpacked by the Republicans. Teacher in Czech Republic. I don't know if you heard, but the Czech Republic has gone from the lowest COVID-19 in Europe to the highest. After the dinner on the Charles Bridge in July, the government said, we're great. Take your masks off now. The virus is gone. And then on September 1st, all the kids went back to school with no masks, no social distance, no plan for a second wave. The Czechs followed U.S. news this summer and protested against masks for their freedom. And this is the result. I'm having symptoms after a month of teaching and going for my test tomorrow. Oh, gosh. I hope you're okay. I'm sorry. Crass rebuttal. Didn't the Republicans already pack the courts by refusing to confirm over 100 of Obama's judges? So I say they need some of their own medicine. I mean, look, pack the courts is just like, if you expand the court, you're not packing the court, right? I mean, it's like, I think the bottom line is that like either we play by the same rules or we don't. If the rules are whatever the Constitution says, you can manipulate those to the point where you can have you're busting the norms in such a way. Then I think you need to do that for the Democrats. I mean, I would prefer them do it anyways, but I'm saying that's the argument. Teacher Dan, at what point do we explicitly call out Democrats for being unwilling to draw the line in the sand for the people as opposed to the party? I mean, repeatedly and publicly shame them. They've had it coming for too long. P.S. Good luck with that remote schooling as a parent. Week 6 teaching is coming up. I know it's a nightmare. Well, I mean, I think it's much easier when they're in power and you can say you have the control of the levers, and that's when you can hold them to account. It's much easier for them to say, like, we can't control this.
This is why being in opposition isn't bad for our opponents in leadership.
Exactly. Serious Sam. Biden and Dems will do little other than say some baseline criticism of how brazen the GOP is being in Amy Coney Barrett seating. They'll use the seating to lack of stimulus before Dem trifecta is sworn in as talking points that defect from having to talk about their agenda beyond criticizing Trump. And we'll get them to seat 2 Garlands after a 6-3 majority is gained. And I'm going big. They will second guess and shoot themselves. All right. I'm not making sense from what you're saying. Father Hovimuckless. Do rank and file Dems know the kabuki nature of their stance on these hearings? It's a sham, but we're participating, or do they just accept the orders they're giving without questioning it? In other words, do they know that it's being done to minimize the pressure to pack the courts, but they can't act to oppose that? Rank and file like Democrats, like people who are going to vote Democrats? No, I don't think so. I mean, look, this is my theory of what they're doing. I don't know that it's true, but I think that's my argument. I'm making my argument. You determine whether you think it's the case or not. Juju, I think it's funny how Sam's arguments against Jamie really just prove that she's right, because as he so widely proves, there is no potential for anything to stop climate change or impending greater depression within the framework that exists. I'm not saying that at all. I don't hear a plan from Sam at all. Seizing means of production isn't just about machetes. Society evolving isn't a collapse of society. It seems a generational issue that Sam conflates Armageddon with.
Society evolving. What does that mean? That's a passive statement. Like, I'm down for, this can't be a passive process. I think is a big problem here.
I'm not conflating Armageddon with social evolution.
Passive.
I think it sounds very passive to me. I would put it on the IMer to make it active.
I got what the point was. people organize to change the world.
Right. I am for people organizing to change the world. I am for people organizing. I'm not conflating Armageddon with social evolution at all. I'm simply saying that when when society, it is fine to say social evolution, but if you do not have concrete examples of what you're talking about, then it means nothing. It's just jibber jabber. And I am suggesting that you need to go even a step beyond having a concrete objective. That concrete objective needs to be realistic. I cannot say that I'm going to grow wings and then I'll be able to fly. That's not going to happen. And I'm saying that the idea of, oh my God, I'm being passive because I don't want to be accused of
revolution.
All right.
Transition. Revolution doesn't have to be violent.
I think that follow-up kind of says it all, actually.
Yeah.
Like, it's
not serious.
Look, we talked about it your way. I listened. I respect it. Then someone brought up, a little bit of something about my way. And I feel like I'm owed the same respect. We're looking at the same set of data. We have very different conclusions about what to do with that data. We both think that we're right.
So what is your plan A?
I don't consider these plan A and plan B. I think these are plans that can be carried out in parallel. Why do we have to have a hierarchy of the plans?
Because we have limited resources. So what is your priority?
Okay, yeah. Well, I think some people are going to have one priority. Probably more people have yours than mine. But my priority is for the left to build a mass working class base and institutional power capable of challenging the power of capital. And that will bring some incremental gains in the short term and hopefully in the long term, a proletarian social revolution.
Okay. So your priority is to build political will for change.
And
right?
Power.
And power. I agree with that. But now we're going to talk about the objectives. What are the objectives going to be?
I mean, yeah, it is true.
What is the priority of the objectives of this movement that we both agree needs to take place?
It is true that my objective is more ambitious and without a precedent because I'm talking about literally progressing from one mode of production to another. And that is going to be a very difficult, possibly impossible thing to do, but nevertheless worth trying because I believe that's the only way to actually un-F the world.
Okay. I understand why you won't answer that question because it's not just unprecedented. What I am arguing is that what you are suggesting is impossible to achieve without a sequencing of other things to happen. And so, and even in that instance, I think it is one of the most far-fetched things I could imagine. There are so many other things that have to happen in society that would create an environment where 2/3 of the American population will vote in referendums in states to abolish the Supreme Court. So many other things that have to happen that by that point, I think it's largely irrelevant.
I mean, I'm not talking specifically about abolishing the Supreme Court.
I'm sorry. You said this entire conversation has been because you said abolish the Supreme Court. And I say that's outlandish.
Well, Josh said abolish the Supreme Court. And I said that would only happen as part of a larger revolutionary horizon, much like when we talk about abolishing the police.
I mean, I think that came up before Josh came up, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, not this time. I mean, I do think the Supreme Court needs to be abolished, but I don't think it's going to happen within the framework of our current system. I think that is absolutely ridiculous.
Which is exactly my point. We're going to have there's so many things that are going to happen that it's going to be irrelevant, the abolishment of the Supreme Court.
But I do think the kind of power that I'm referring to and the kind of revolutionary project, which is, maybe it's possible, maybe it's not, but it should still be oriented towards an anti-capitalist horizon, will result as well if we are building power in the correct fashion in the kind of reforms that you are talking about.
Well, there is a hearing that is taking place these days, and I guess what frustrates me is that this has been a waste of very limited time, frankly. I mean, that's my feeling, is that there is like the there is a gaping, the house is on fire. And I don't think there's an appreciation of it, but we will spend more time talking about the implications of this.
I appreciate it.
No, I don't think so.
I'm not trying to argue with any of the stuff that you're saying. I'm just saying that my idea and my project, I believe, is also very important. And in the long term,
I think the problem is that there is a conflict in projects in this moment. And that's what I think frustrates me. I would agree with that. All right.
I support your project. I do. You convinced me that the courts are important, and I endorse everything that you've said about it.
Abu Manshu, in the event of a Biden victory, the left needs an immediate media blitz to promote the narrative that the Biden win means that voters are in favor of all the leftist policies that Trump claims Biden is for in order to pressure Biden. I agree with that. Darts. Oh gosh. All right. 2 more IMs and then we're out of here. Do farts smell the same in space? Joined last week after a few years of flirting with the show. Even dirty anarchists need daily news, and y'all have kept me sane throughout this hell of a year. Buy a gun, folks. Juggernaut Magnum.
I went shooting the other day. P.S.
Juggernaut Magnum. As someone who respects the clash of neolibs and progressives, if we apologize to America, Trump is our fault. We didn't do enough. So here's what we're going to do. Could be a unified party fighting Republicans while battling how we get there, but we'd own the argument with conviction. I don't understand what that means.
It's not about the argument we pose to people.
All right, folks. See you tomorrow.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bar, but finding out won't make me feel any better.